The temperature reads -40 degrees. A German soldier tries to pull the trigger of his rifle. His finger won't move. It's frozen to the metal. He screams, but the sound barely escapes his cracked, bleeding lips. Around him, thousands of men huddle in shallow holes dug into frozen earth. Their uniforms are thin, their boots are falling apart, their faces are blackened with frostbite. One soldier whispers to another, "We conquered France in 6 weeks. How is this happening?" Then, through the blizzard, they hear it. The rumble of Soviet tanks. The sound grows louder, closer, and these men, the most feared army in the world, realize something horrifying. They're not the hunters anymore. They're the prey. December 1941, the Eastern Front. Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union 6 months earlier with the largest military force ever assembled. 4 million men, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces. They called it Operation Barbarossa, and for months it looked unstoppable. The Wehrmacht crushed Soviet defenses, they captured millions of prisoners, they advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. Hitler believed Moscow would fall before winter. His generals believed the war would be over by Christmas. But there was one enemy they never planned for. One force that didn't care about tactics or technology or military genius. Winter. Let's rewind to June 22, 1941, the day the invasion began. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory at dawn. The weather was warm, the roads were dry, the mood was confident. Hitler had studied Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia in 1812. He knew winter had destroyed the French army, so he made a simple calculation: finish the war before winter arrives. 6 months, that's all they needed. The German Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had already conquered Poland in 4 weeks. France fell in 6. Yugoslavia collapsed in 11 days. The Soviets would be no different. Or so they thought. At first, everything went according to plan. German panzers raced across Soviet territory. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. By September, Leningrad was under siege. By October, German troops could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Moscow was less than 20 miles away. Victory felt inevitable. But then something changed. The temperature dropped. At first, it was just cold, uncomfortable but manageable. Then it got colder, and colder, and colder. By November, it was -20 degrees Celsius. By December, -40. Here's what they never told you in history class. The German army had no winter clothing. None. No heavy coats, no thermal underwear, no insulated boots. Why? Because the High Command genuinely believed the war would be over before winter. Shipping winter gear would be a waste of resources. So 3 million men were fighting in the same uniforms they'd worn in France. Imagine standing outside in -40-degree weather wearing a business suit. Now imagine doing that for months while someone's shooting at you. Soldiers stuffed newspapers under their uniforms for insulation. They wrapped their feet in straw and paper. They huddled around fires, knowing the smoke would give away their position to Soviet artillery. It didn't matter. They were freezing to death anyway. Frostbite spread through the army like a plague. Men lost fingers, toes, ears, noses. Entire limbs turned black and had to be amputated, often without anesthesia, because medical supplies were frozen solid. Field hospitals overflowed with frostbite cases. More German soldiers were being evacuated for cold injuries than combat wounds. But the cold wasn't just killing soldiers, it was killing everything. Here's where it gets worse. German weapons were designed for the moderate climate of Western Europe. They weren't built for Russian winter. Rifle bolts froze solid, machine guns jammed, artillery pieces wouldn't fire. The lubrication in tanks and trucks turned to gel, seizing engines completely. Soldiers tried to keep their weapons warm by sleeping with them. They built fires under tanks to thaw the engines every morning, a process that took hours and consumed precious fuel. Speaking of fuel, the cold made gasoline thicker, less combustible. Diesel fuel turned to wax. Tank engines that did start burned through fuel twice as fast, trying to generate heat. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles from Germany to the front, and most of that supply network ran on horses. Yes, horses. Despite the image of a fully mechanized German war machine, the Wehrmacht relied on hundreds of thousands of horses to pull supply wagons, artillery, and equipment. Those horses needed food, lots of it. But there was no food. The frozen ground meant no grass. Supply trains couldn't deliver enough fodder, so the horses starved. Tens of thousands of them died. The soldiers ate them. When the horse meat ran out, they ate their leather belts, their boots, anything organic. Starvation set in. Now picture this. You're a 19-year-old German soldier. 6 months ago, you were part of the greatest military force on earth. You marched through Poland, through France, through Yugoslavia like a god of war. Now you're huddled in a frozen hole, wearing a dead Russian's coat because it's warmer than your own, gnawing on frozen horse meat. Your rifle doesn't work, and you haven't felt your feet in 3 days. And you can hear the Soviet tanks coming. This part was erased from every textbook. The German army, the feared Wehrmacht, was collapsing not from combat, but from cold. Combat effectiveness dropped by 80% in some divisions. Officers reported that their men were too weak from cold and hunger to fight effectively. Entire battalions were combat ineffective without firing a shot. Meanwhile, the Soviets were built for this. Soviet soldiers had quilted winter uniforms, felt boots called valenki, fur hats. Their weapons were designed for extreme cold, simple, robust, reliable. The T-34 tank had a diesel engine that could start in any temperature, wide tracks that didn't sink in snow, sloped armor that deflected German shells. Soviet ski troops moved silently through forests, invisible in white camouflage, striking German positions and vanishing like ghosts. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers who'd spent months advancing now found themselves retreating, dying, freezing. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We're not fighting the Russians anymore. We're fighting the cold, and the cold is winning." December 5, 1941. The temperature drops to -45 degrees. A new order comes down from Soviet High Command. Counterattack. Fresh Soviet divisions, pulled from Siberia where -40 is normal, launch a massive offensive. These weren't the same troops the Germans had been fighting. These were hardened, winter-trained soldiers who'd grown up in this cold. They moved fast, fought hard, showed no mercy. The German line shattered. Entire divisions retreated in chaos. Soldiers abandoned equipment they couldn't carry. Tanks and trucks were left where they froze, useless metal coffins dotting the landscape. The retreat became a rout. Men staggered through the snow, bleeding, frostbitten, starving. Those who fell behind froze to death within minutes. Soviet partisans ambushed columns on forest roads. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and in ground frozen solid, burial was impossible anyway. The corpses stayed where they fell, frozen in grotesque positions, monuments to hubris and miscalculation. One German officer wrote in his diary, Napoleon's retreat from Moscow was a summer picnic compared to this. By January 1942, the German army had suffered over 900,000 casualties. Let that number sink in. 900,000. In 6 months. That's more than the entire populations of some countries. And here's the part that should make you angry. Most of those casualties were preventable. If the High Command had issued winter clothing, hundreds of thousands wouldn't have frozen. If they'd prepared for a long campaign, instead of assuming quick victory, the supply lines wouldn't have collapsed. If they'd listened to their own intelligence reports warning that the Soviets were stronger than expected, they might have reconsidered the entire invasion. But they didn't, because arrogance is deadlier than any weapon. Hitler himself forbade retreat. He ordered his armies to hold their positions no matter the cost, so soldiers froze in place, literally. Some were found frozen to death still standing at their posts, rifles in hand, eyes open, covered in snow. The cold preserved everything. Years later, when the snow melted, the bodies were still there, thousands of them, frozen in time. A grotesque reminder of what happens when you underestimate nature. Now here's what history tried to bury. The catastrophe of the first winter on the Eastern Front wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a strategic turning point that changed the entire war. Before winter 1941, Germany looked invincible. After winter 1941, everyone knew they could be beaten. The myth of German military supremacy died in the snow outside Moscow, and the consequences echoed for years. The Wehrmacht never fully recovered from that winter. The loss of experienced soldiers, officers, and equipment created holes that couldn't be filled. Germany was now fighting a war of attrition, exactly the kind of war they couldn't win. But here's the deeper truth. Winter didn't just defeat the German army, it revealed the fatal flaw in their entire ideology. The Nazis believed they were a superior race, destined to conquer inferior peoples. They believed technology and willpower could overcome any obstacle. They believed nature itself would bend to their will. Winter proved them wrong. You can't intimidate cold. You can't outthink frostbite. You can't blitzkrieg the weather. Nature doesn't care about your ideology, your technology, or your ambitions. It just is, and if you're not prepared, it will kill you. The historian William Craig wrote, "The German army learned what the Mongols, the Swedes, and Napoleon had learned before them. Russia is not a country you conquer. Russia is a country that conquers you." But there's another truth buried even deeper. The suffering wasn't limited to soldiers. Soviet civilians endured horrors beyond imagination. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. Over 1 million civilians starved or froze to death. People ate wallpaper paste, leather, sawdust, anything. Corpses lined the streets, too many to bury. In Belarus, entire villages were burned with their inhabitants inside. In Ukraine, mass executions became routine. The Eastern Front wasn't just a military campaign, it was genocide with a military escort. And winter was the great equalizer that finally stopped it from spreading further. Some historians argue that winter saved millions of lives by halting the German advance. If Moscow had fallen, if the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Nazis would have had the resources to murder millions more. Winter, brutal, merciless, indiscriminate winter, became an unlikely ally to humanity. Let's talk about what happened next. The war on the Eastern Front continued for 3 more years, 3 more winters. But the Germans learned from their mistakes. They issued winter clothing, they developed cold weather equipment, they adapted. But it was too late. The initiative had shifted to the Soviets, and momentum in war is everything. The Eastern Front became the grinder that pulverized the German army. Of the roughly 5 million German military deaths in World War II, about 4 million occurred on the Eastern Front. Think about that ratio. 80% of German military deaths happened fighting the Soviets. The beaches of Normandy, the skies over Britain, the deserts of North Africa, all of those combined account for only 20%. The real war was in the East, and winter was the weapon that turned the tide. By 1945, Soviet forces were advancing on Berlin. German soldiers, many who'd survived that first terrible winter, now faced defeat on their own soil. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1941 ended in May 1945, with Berlin in ruins and Germany unconditionally surrendering. Hitler, who'd refused to accept the reality of winter 4 years earlier, died in a bunker as Soviet artillery pounded the city above. The cold that couldn't be conquered had set in motion the sequence of events that ended his regime. So why does this matter today? Because the lessons of winter 1941 are still being ignored. Military planners still underestimate logistics, leaders still assume technology can overcome nature, generals still launch campaigns based on optimism rather than reality. In 2022, another army invaded another part of the former Soviet Union. Russia invaded Ukraine, and once again planners assumed it would be over quickly. Once again, they were wrong. Once again, winter became a factor. The patterns repeat because humans forget. We forget that nature doesn't negotiate, that cold doesn't care about your timeline, that hunger and frostbite don't respect military rank. We forget that the most advanced weapons in the world are useless if the soldiers operating them can't feel their fingers. We forget that wars are fought by human beings, fragile, mortal, vulnerable human beings who need food, warmth, and shelter to survive. Strip away the politics, the ideology, the grand strategies, and war comes down to this: can you keep your soldiers alive long enough to fight? In winter 1941, Germany couldn't, and that changed everything. But let's bring this back to the individual level, because statistics like 900,000 casualties are so massive they become meaningless. Let's talk about one soldier. His name was Friedrich Müller, 22 years old, from Bavaria. He wrote letters home to his mother throughout the invasion. In June, he wrote, "The countryside is beautiful. We'll be home by fall." In August, "The fighting is hard, but we're winning." In October, "It's getting cold. We were told warm clothing is coming." In November, "Mother, my feet are black. I can't feel them anymore. Please send wool socks if you can." December, "We're retreating. I don't understand how this happened. All I want is to see home again." His last letter was found on his frozen body in January 1942. He never mailed it. Multiply Friedrich Müller by 900,000, each one a son, brother, father, husband, each one dreaming of home, each one dying in the snow, thousands of miles from anywhere that mattered. And that's just the German side. Soviet casualties were even higher, military and civilian combined. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people. 27 million. Every one of those was a person with dreams, fears, families, futures. All of it consumed by war and winter. The cold doesn't discriminate. It kills the invader and the defender with equal efficiency. It kills the Nazi and the communist and the innocent civilian caught between them. Winter is the ultimate equalizer. Here are some details that didn't make it into most history books. German soldiers nicknamed the Eastern Front the White Hell. Soviet ski troops were called the White Death by terrified German soldiers who never saw them coming through the snow. Some German divisions lost more men to frostbite than to enemy fire in December 1941. Doctors performed thousands of amputations in field hospitals with inadequate supplies. Many soldiers chose to keep their frozen limbs and risk death from gangrene rather than face amputation. The Soviets developed a tactic of attacking at dawn when German weapons were most likely to be frozen and inoperable. German tank crews sometimes burned their own tanks rather than abandon them to the Soviets, sitting inside until the last moment to stay warm. Horses died so fast that supply units couldn't bury or dispose of them. Frozen horse carcasses lined the roads, landmarks for retreating soldiers. Some German soldiers went insane from the cold and wandered off into the blizzards, never to be seen again. Soviet records show that German prisoners captured in January 1942 were in such poor condition that many died within days despite being given food and shelter. Years after the war, farmers in Russia and Belarus would find German equipment buried in the fields, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. And the bodies, they're still finding bodies. Even now, 80 years later, construction projects uncover mass graves. Peat bogs preserve uniforms and equipment. Forests hold secrets that winter buried and never released. The cold keeps everything. You want to know the most infuriating part? They were warned. German intelligence reports before the invasion stated clearly, Soviet industrial capacity is greater than estimated. Soviet military reserves are deeper than expected. Russian winter conditions are extreme and must be planned for. These reports were filed, read, and ignored. Hitler dismissed them. He told his generals, "We only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He believed the Soviet Union was weak, incompetent, racially inferior. He believed one good push would topple the entire system. He was catastrophically wrong. And here's what makes it worse. This wasn't even original thinking. Napoleon had thought the exact same thing in 1812. Napoleon had also ignored winter. Napoleon had also seen his army destroyed by cold and hunger. History had already taught this lesson. But arrogance makes us believe we're different, that we're smarter, that the rules don't apply to us. Yes, Napoleon failed, but he didn't have modern technology. Yes, winter is harsh, but we have superior logistics. Yes, the Soviets are numerous, but we have superior training and tactics. Every one of those assumptions proved false. Technology froze. Logistics collapsed. Training doesn't matter when you're dying of hypothermia. The same hubris that started the invasion guaranteed its failure. Back in Germany, the propaganda machine worked overtime to hide the disaster. Newsreels showed victorious soldiers advancing through snow. Radio broadcasts claimed the army was strategically regrouping. Newspapers printed stories of heroic stands against barbaric Asiatic hordes. None of it mentioned the truth. The army was disintegrating. Families received letters heavily censored by the military authorities. Any mention of cold, hunger, or desperation was blacked out. When the casualty lists grew too long to hide, the government simply stopped publishing them. Soldiers on leave were forbidden from discussing conditions on the Eastern Front. Anyone who spoke too openly risked arrest by the Gestapo. The gap between propaganda and reality became a chasm. In Berlin, officials celebrated victories. At the front, men ate their dead horses and froze to death in foxholes. This is why history tried to bury this story, because it revealed the lie at the heart of the regime. The Nazis built their entire ideology on the myth of Aryan supremacy, of German efficiency, of unstoppable will. Winter destroyed that myth. It showed that Germans could freeze just as easily as anyone else, that their weapons failed, that their planning was incompetent, that their leadership was criminally negligent. The master race defeated by weather. It was humiliating, so they buried it. They blamed individual commanders. They blamed the Soviets for fighting unfairly with winter as an ally. They blamed anyone and everyone except the fundamental flaws in their own thinking. But the truth has a way of surviving. It survives in letters home, in diaries found on frozen corpses, in photographs soldiers took against orders, in the testimony of survivors who decades later finally spoke about what they'd endured. The truth survives. Here's the ultimate irony. The Nazis invaded the Soviet Union partly to secure resources, oil, grain, minerals. They needed these resources to continue the war, but the invasion consumed so many resources that it crippled their ability to wage war anywhere else. They invaded to gain strength. The invasion made them weaker. They launched Operation Barbarossa with 4 million men. By spring 1942, over 1 million were dead, wounded, or missing. They started with the most powerful military in Europe. Winter reduced it to a shadow of itself, and the war, which they'd hoped to finish in 6 months, would drag on for another 3.5 years, consuming everything: men, material, cities, entire societies, all because they didn't pack winter coats. It sounds absurd when you say it like that, but that's what it comes down to. Logistics matter more than strategy. Preparation matters more than ideology. Reality matters more than wishful thinking. These are simple truths, but humans keep forgetting them, and so history repeats. Different uniforms, different weapons, different slogans, same mistakes, same consequences, same frozen bodies in the snow. Let's talk about something most people never consider. Winter was probably the most powerful weapon of World War II. Not the atomic bomb, not the tank or the aircraft carrier or the U-boat. Winter. It killed more German soldiers than any Soviet weapon system. It destroyed more equipment than any bombing campaign. It halted the largest invasion in history in its tracks. And it cost nothing. The Soviets didn't have to build it or transport it or aim it. They just had to wait. General Winter, they called it, an ancient Russian ally that had defeated invaders for centuries. But here's the thing. Winter isn't really a weapon because it has no loyalty. It killed Soviet soldiers too, Soviet civilians, Soviet horses and trucks and tanks. Winter doesn't take sides. It just kills. The difference was preparation. The Soviets knew winter was coming. They'd lived through Russian winters their entire lives. They knew what was needed to survive. The Germans knew winter was coming too. They just didn't believe it would matter. That's the difference between respecting nature and ignoring it. One keeps you alive, the other kills you. Imagine you're a German soldier in December 1941. 6 months ago, you were invincible. You'd conquered Europe, crushed every enemy, marched under triumphal arches. You believed in your mission, your leaders, your destiny. Now you're freezing in a hole, watching friends die from frostbite, eating horse meat, and the Russians you were told were subhuman are beating you. The psychological impact was devastating. Letters from the front show it clearly. I no longer believe in anything. God has abandoned us to this hell. We were lied to about everything. Morale collapsed faster than supply lines. Soldiers stopped caring about ideology or victory or anything except survival. Some shot themselves rather than face another day in the cold. Others walked toward Soviet lines with their hands up, preferring captivity to another night in the snow. Combat effectiveness wasn't just reduced by cold and hunger. It was destroyed by the realization that everything they'd been told was a lie. The war was not winnable. The enemy was not weak. The Reich was not invincible. And they were going to die in this frozen wasteland for nothing. That psychological break, multiplied across an army of millions, was as decisive as any battle. You can't win wars with broken men, and winter broke them. December 1941 marked more than just the failure of Operation Barbarossa. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, because on the exact same week that the German advance stalled in the Soviet Union, something else happened. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. 4 days later, Germany declared war on the United States. Hitler, already fighting the largest country in the world in the East, now added the most industrialized country in the West. This is what happens when ideology replaces strategy. Germany was now fighting on multiple fronts: the Soviet Union in the East, Britain in the West and South, the United States joining Britain, partisan resistance across occupied Europe, and winter, always winter. The war became unwinnable in that single week, but it would take 3.5 more years of unimaginable destruction to reach the inevitable conclusion. Millions more would die. Entire cities would be reduced to rubble. The Holocaust would claim 6 million Jewish lives and millions of others. All of it could have been prevented if Operation Barbarossa had succeeded, or if it had never been launched at all. Winter ensured it failed, and in failing, it set in motion everything that followed. Not everyone died, of course. Some survived. They made it through that first winter, then the second, then the third. They watched friends freeze. They lost fingers and toes. They saw things that would haunt them forever. And after the war, they went home, or tried to. Many German soldiers who survived the Eastern Front ended up in Soviet prison camps. Some stayed there for years after the war ended. Many never returned. Those who did make it home found a country destroyed, occupied, divided. They found families who couldn't understand what they'd experienced. How do you explain frostbite to someone who's never been that cold? How do you describe watching your best friend freeze to death? How do you talk about the things you did to survive? Most didn't. They buried it. They tried to forget. They told their children nothing or told them lies, sanitized versions with all the horror removed. And so the truth was buried again, not by propaganda this time, but by silence, by shame, by the inability of language to capture certain experiences. But in the last years of their lives, some survivors finally spoke. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, told the truth. One veteran said, "I want people to know what happened, not so they'll feel sorry for us. We made our choices, but so they'll understand what war really is. Not the movies, not the glory, the cold, the hunger, the fear, the absolute waste of it all." Another said, "Winter didn't care which side we were on. That's what I remember most. The cold didn't care about flags or politics or who was right. It just killed everyone equally. Maybe that's the real lesson." Here are questions historians still argue about. Could Germany have won if they'd prepared for winter? Probably not. The Soviet Union was too large, too populous, too resilient, but the war would have lasted longer and killed even more people. Did winter alone defeat Germany? No, but it was the critical factor that stopped the invasion and shifted momentum permanently. What if Moscow had fallen? We don't know. Maybe the Soviet government collapses. Maybe they regroup beyond the Urals and continue fighting. Maybe the war ends completely differently. Why didn't German intelligence prevent this disaster? They tried. Their reports were accurate, but intelligence only matters if leadership listens. Hitler didn't. Could this happen again? Look around. Military overconfidence hasn't disappeared. Neither has the tendency to underestimate logistics, dismiss warnings, or assume technology can overcome nature. The conditions for repeating this catastrophe still exist. Different countries, different ideologies, different technologies, same human flaws. Military academies teach the Eastern Front. They study the strategies, the battles, the tactics. They teach Stalingrad and Kursk in Berlin. They teach armored warfare and combined arms operations. But here's what they often skip: the primacy of logistics, the importance of realistic planning, the danger of ideological thinking overriding practical reality, the fact that nature always wins. Because those lessons are boring. They're not dramatic, not cinematic, not glorious. There's no excitement in saying we lost because we didn't bring enough coats. It's easier to focus on grand strategy and military genius than to acknowledge that wars are won and lost on supply line spreadsheets and weather forecasts. But the soldiers who were there knew the truth. One German general wrote after the war, "We studied Clausewitz and Schlieffen and Napoleon. We thought we understood warfare. Then we met winter, and we realized we understood nothing." The Eastern Front taught that nature is stronger than any army. Logistics matter more than tactics. Hubris kills. Simple lessons, but we keep forgetting them. Today, if you travel to Russia, you can still see the traces. Monuments mark the battles. Mass graves hold the dead. Museums display the artifacts, frozen uniforms, broken weapons, letters home that never arrived. Outside Moscow, there's a memorial to the winter of 1941 to 42. It's a simple stone marker. The inscription reads, "Here, invincibility met its end." Not because of superior strategy, not because of better weapons, because winter came and the invaders weren't ready. Nearby, there's another memorial, this one for Soviet soldiers and civilians. 27 million names. You could spend a year reading them and not finish. Each one a life, each one erased by war, by ideology, by the arrogance of men who thought they could conquer anything. Winter didn't end the war, but it began the end, and that made all the difference. So here's the final truth. When winter became the deadliest enemy, it exposed something fundamental about human nature. We build civilizations, we create technology, we write philosophies and ideologies. We convince ourselves we've transcended nature, that we've conquered the world, that we're masters of our destiny. And then winter comes, and we remember that we're just flesh and blood, that we need warmth and food and shelter, that we're fragile, that we're mortal, that all our grand plans and mighty armies mean nothing if we can't keep our soldiers' fingers from freezing to their triggers. The German army learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. 900,000 casualties, most of them preventable, most of them unnecessary, most of them caused not by the enemy, but by failure to respect reality. That's the part that should keep you awake at night. Not that winter is harsh, we know that, but that humans, even when warned, even when history has taught the lesson repeatedly, still make the same mistakes, still let arrogance override caution, still sacrifice lives for ideology, still believe that somehow this time we'll be different. We won't. Not unless we remember, not unless we learn, not unless we understand that winter doesn't care about your ambitions, your technology, your destiny. Winter just is, and if you're not prepared, it will kill you every single time. It's December again, somewhere in Russia. Snow falls on frozen fields, the wind howls across empty steppes, and buried beneath the snow, beneath the earth, beneath 80 years of history, they're still there, the bodies, German and Soviet, horse and human, all equal now, all frozen, all forgotten by everyone except winter, which remembers everything, which forgets nothing, which waits patient and eternal for the next army, the next invasion, the next group of men who think they're different, who think they're prepared, who think they'll be the ones to finally conquer the cold. Winter will be waiting. Winter is always waiting. And winter always wins.
This is why history tried to bury this story, because it proves that nature is more powerful than nations, that hubris kills more surely than any weapon, that the deadliest enemy isn't the one you fight, it's the one you ignore. Winter didn't just defeat an army, it defeated an ideology, it defeated the myth of supremacy and invincibility, and it did it without firing a single shot. Remember that.